welcome everybody to part two of our parental alienation workshop. I think this is the part that everyone's been looking forward to, with a focus on intervention. But I'm not going to say very much more because we are pressed for time today. I do know, as Bob had previously spoke to me about, that we will have a 20-minute break in between today's workshop. And of course, I'll let Bob set that timing.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Shabniz. Welcome everyone to part two. It's great to be doing this. I certainly enjoy presenting this material. And as I'm actively involved in doing the work, and I know you are as well. So if you have things that you want to share or questions you want to ask as we go along, you can unmute and just ask me directly, or you can put a question in the chat. And when I get a chance, I'll get to those questions as well. So one of the things I want to start off with, which is a little bit different from part one, is I want to just teach you some energy psychology techniques, which I use often with my clients to help them get grounded and centered. And I think it's good in a workshop in particular because some of these techniques help turn our brain on and help the left and right hemispheres to be communicating properly so that we can absorb material. So if you would just follow along with me, if you can see me on screen, this is called the thymus thump. And the thymus is just right where my hand is, between the throat and the upper chest. And we just thump that a few times, so just follow along with me. And what this does is stimulate your immune system. So just do that for a few times. Good. And now we're going to do what's called the ear unroll. Now the ears have a lot of acupuncture points and meridians that are in the ears. So when we unroll them, we're stimulating all of those acupuncture points, in particular, our ability to process auditory information. Okay. So just do that a few times. Okay. And then putting your arm straight out in front of you with your thumb. Do this in a figure eight, so like this, and just following it with your eyes, going both sides. Yeah, that's it, figure eight. And then the other side, the other thumb. Good. And then putting your thumbs together, making sure you're going both sides. And that turns on the visual processing in the brain and gets the left and right brain to start to communicate with each other. Next one is called the cross crawl. So you can do this sitting. What you do is just touch with your right hand, you touch your left leg, with your left hand, you touch your right leg, and you just go back and forth, lifting your knees slightly off the floor. And once again, that's getting both sides of the brain to communicate. And if you're familiar with EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, they use eye movements, but they also will use body movements while the person is processing a negative memory or negative experience. The next one would be what we call a meridian trace. So the yin meridians go along the inside of the body. So if you're looking at my arm, it goes along from the face down to the hand, and then up the other side, the yang meridians go back up the arm. So we like to trace the meridians on the face, down the front, and then back up. And you can do that several times. And then same with the legs. So go down the outside of your legs. There are meridians, yang meridians that go down the outside of the legs and come back up the inside of the legs. And you do that 3 times. And that gets the energy flowing through all the meridians. Okay, good. And then we want to turn on what we call the neurolymphatic energy switches for the brain. And these are located just at the top of the shoulder here, if you can see my hand, right in the groove in there between the shoulder socket and the pec muscles. So just rub that vigorously for about 20-30 seconds. And often they're sore and tender, which means that they need to be rubbed because there's energy blocked in those areas. Okay, and then the other side, the other shoulder. Okay. Okay. All right, great. So that should help all of us to get our brains in gear, so to speak. And as I say, I use those techniques at the beginning of sessions with a lot of my clients. It once again helps them to get centered and grounded, gets their energy moving in the right direction, and also has a calming effect for most people. Most people want to start a session by talking a lot and saying a lot of things about their narrative and about their stories and that kind of thing. So this really helps them to kind of get more into their body and more in touch with their emotions and gets them out of their head more so. So you might want to, if you need any references on that, I can provide that for you, but, or you may also be familiar with some of those already. All right, so we're going to go to slide number 9. So this is just a bit of a review from last time. Richard Gardner's criteria, there's 8 of them that he used to define parental alienation. So these would be symptoms that a child would present with. And as we'll get into the material later, but as we get into determining whether a case is mild, moderate, or severe, severe cases tend to have all of these criteria. Moderate cases also have most of these criteria. Mild cases might just have 1 or 2. So it's one way of differentiating the severity of the case as well. And so typically the child will present with a campaign of hatred and denigration by the favored parent, or the favored parent is the one that is brainwashing them or influencing them through their own hatred and denigration. And the child's reasons to reject the rejected parent are frivolous, at times nonsensical. And if you listen to these children, they will tell you some pretty tall tales. And when you start to inquire in more detail about a particular incident, you soon discover that they can't put 2 and 2 together. So they will have a hard time coming up with the realistic details for the situation. They lack ambivalence, and that's what we call splitting. And we'll talk more about that later, but this is where the child idealizes the favorite parent and denigrates the rejected parent. The child will insist their views about the rejected parent are their own. I'll ask many children this type of question. So did your mom or your dad tell you about this? Or how did you come up with this conclusion? Oh no, I came up with this on my own. It has nothing to do with my parents. The child supports the favored parent without question. And often we'll find that there's enmeshment there in that relationship. The child lacks guilt over the rejection. So you may say to a child, well, you know, you swore at your father, you said some really mean things to them. You know, how do you think that affected them emotionally? And they will just say, oh, I don't know. Oh, I don't care. He deserves it. Stuff like that. So they lack guilt and remorse. Sometimes they will use phrases or scripts that are similar to the favorite parent, and often they will reject the extended family or friends of their rejected parent. Okay, so number 20, Leslie. So once again, this is just a quick review. So Michael Bone came up with these 4 characteristics of moderate to severe alienation cases. So the favored parent often blocks contact between the child and the rejected parent. They're often making unfounded abuse allegations. Probably one of the most frequent ones would be sexual abuse, but there's also domestic violence allegations that are not substantiated. And even after the initial allegations are not substantiated, they will come up with more allegations and new and different ones. Post-separation relationship between the child and the parent deteriorates, and sometimes it can deteriorate very, very quickly. Even within a few days or a week, a child will go from visiting the rejected parent and seeming to have a good time at their home to, I don't want to see them anymore. I want nothing more to do with them. A child sometimes will develop a phobic reaction to the rejected parent, very, very high levels of anxiety. If you even mention their name, they will have a phobic response. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I want to say a bit about, well, actually, before I go into this slide, let me just mention as well, because we finished off the last session with Amy Baker's video on the 4 characteristics of alienation cases. So she said the first one was that the child had a previous positive relationship with the rejected parent. The second one would be there's no evidence of child abuse or deficient parenting. Third characteristic is that the alienating parent uses multiple methods to alienate. And the last characteristic is that all of Gardner's 8 criteria are present. So those are all assessment kinds of tools that you can use, and we're just doing it as a quick review. All right, so with respect to family violence and parental alienation, often I find probably 40 to 45% of high conflict cases involve domestic violence of various kinds. Now, within the Family Law Act, domestic violence is defined in a very broad way. So it doesn't just include physical violence, it includes emotional, verbal types of violence. So it's a very, very broad definition. So if we use that broad definition in high conflict families, you're going to find a very high percentage of domestic violence, at very least verbal and emotional violence. And sometimes and we have to look at the different types of family violence or domestic violence, because they're not all the same. So you can get situational types of domestic violence where a couple are having an argument and they both engage in various kinds of domestic abuse. They may be verbally and emotionally abusive to each other. They may even hit each other. And it's often in response to some kind of a situation that has occurred. So for example, let's say one of the partners, this is pre-separation, one of the partners discloses an affair. And that leads to high conflict and various forms of domestic violence. So that's more of an interactional pattern, a negative interactional pattern and cycle that goes on within the couple's relationship. And this could be a co-parent relationship as well. And that's different from coercive controlling violence, where you tend to have one person who is the controlling person, the controller in the relationship. And they use power and control to dominate and intimidate the other partner. And after they separate, and the reason I bring this up is Shabiz brought this case to my attention that we wanted to have some discussion about this. So post-separation, the coercive controlling partner may continue to exercise those kinds of intimidation tactics. And they may, in fact, alienate the child from the other parent as a form of power and control and aggression against the other parent. And so this becomes kind of a double whammy. Not only is the victimized partner subject to ongoing verbal and emotional abuse, often through text message, email, sometimes over the phone, sometimes at transitions, but they also are now being alienated from the child or children. So this is obviously a very, very concerning situation, very complex situation. And the ideal intervention is for something to be done about it right away. And usually you need a restraining order, protection order, you need some kind of court order that stops this kind of behavior, because the child knows which side of their bread is buttered on, and they know that the coercive controlling parent can do them harm as well as the other parent. And so they tend to be quite scared and intimidated by the favored parent, and they will do what they say. So the child can become alienated very, very quickly, and can begin to come up with all kinds of rationalizations as to why they shouldn't see the rejected parent. With domestic violence, of course, you often have trauma of different degrees and severity and types. So you definitely need to ask questions about that. But if you get a case where there's a mixture of domestic violence and parental alienation, I tend to ask separate questions about each of those dynamics. Excuse me, even though they're interwoven. I will ask about the history of domestic violence. I'll ask about risk factors. And then I will also do an assessment of the parental alienation, when that started, how it started, et cetera. So you might want to start off by assessing each of those almost as separate issues, even though they do interweave together. Of course, you want to know whether the child was present during domestic violence and whether they had been traumatized by it. Any police or ministry involvement. Was one parent arrested? Was there a restraining order? And this obviously can be a protective measure and often is needed, particularly with coercive controlling violence. But with other types of allegations of domestic violence, one parent being arrested or a restraining order being put in place so that they no longer see the children. And in fact, because the court system tends to go very slowly in trying to resolve these matters, the parent who was allegedly the perpetrator, and it may be unsubstantiated, may be found to be unsubstantiated, still is separated from their children for often months at a time, maybe even longer. And you can imagine what that does to the attachment between the rejected parent and the child. So these situations need to be assessed very carefully, not only by the police and the ministry, but by other professionals who become involved with the family, as to whether these are really substantiated or whether, in fact, the spouse who claims to be the victim is actually the aggressor. So very important to be able to assess that over time. And I want to add as well that just filling out a few questionnaires and getting them to answer a few questionnaires is not going to help you to get to know the family. These families and these parents engage in deception, they lie, they embellish their stories. So it may take you quite a while getting to know a family before you really know what's going on and what the dynamics are. Another important question to ask yourself is, how do the parents attribute blame? What's the narrative that they come up with? Right? I'm dealing with a file right now where the mother alleges verbal and emotional abuse by the father. The father denies it, and they each have quite extensive, detailed narratives about their allegation and why they're right. So you can imagine the children who are in the middle of these two narratives, how they try to make sense of this. It can be very, very confusing. And so often it's the child who's most influenced by a parent takes on the narrative of that parent. Are there any realistic safety issues? Once again, the effects of the attachment disruption on the parent-child relationship, and then the role of the legal process. So if it's under CFCSA, there's a different type of process going on there as opposed to the Family Law Act. I would say probably CFCSA has the advantage of there's going to be an immediate investigation. Disadvantage sometimes is that the ministry pulls out of the situation, in my view, too soon before they really assess whether there's any alienation going on. The Family Law Act process can be long and drawn out. You can have a Section 211 being ordered, takes months to do that. Many court appearances. The parent who maybe isn't seeing the child may not even get supervised parenting time for many months. So it can be a long, drawn-out process and very, very expensive. Okay, so Wesley, if we can go to slide 23. Dynamics in the alienating family. Great, thank you. Okay. So not all parents who are, not all favored parents who can also be referred to as alienating parents are the same. So the naive alienator is a parent who, they tend to be fairly passive about the child's relationship with the other parent. However, they often harbor negative beliefs and feelings about the other parent. once again, I've got a file right now where I would say the mother is a naive alienator. She disclosed to me the other day that because the child had said a number of FU over text message to the father, and the father asked, well, is she going to be disciplined for this? And mother really didn't do anything about it. She was quite passive about it. But I asked her, so why didn't you do anything about this? Right? I mean, the child is learning to be disrespectful, even if they don't agree with what the father's doing. And she said, well, he doesn't deserve an apology, right? So obviously there are negative feelings and negative beliefs behind her actions. And it's important with the naive alienator to be able to bring those to the surface and get them to examine them. So the naive alienator doesn't view themselves as alienating. However, they occasionally say or do things to alienate. So the example I just gave, where she didn't discipline her daughter for disrespectful behavior, would be an example of sort of a passive alienating kind of behavior. They also tend to feel insulted if you refer to them as alienators, and they will become quite dramatic about that if they are accused of that. And often they have a very deep fear of being accused of being an alienator, particularly in a court situation. Conscious alienators, these are folks who do know that what they're doing is wrong, that they are alienating. They tend to be very hurt and angry, and they will exhibit alienating behaviors when they get triggered, typically by the other parent. But they do know what they're doing is wrong. And once again, with these folks, you need to help them to come to terms with their emotions. Often there's a lot of past historical stuff that they haven't come to terms with. There may have been a humiliating type of separation that occurred that hurt them very deeply. And so even though they know what they're doing is wrong, sometimes they will say they can't help themselves. They're just too upset. Now the malicious alienator. These are folks who cause the most damage. They persistently alienate using a variety of tactics. Often they have a personality disorder. They will rationalize to themselves that their behavior is justified because of what the other parent is doing or has done. They rarely show empathy for the rejected parent, and they often lack insight and judgment around their own behavior. So they externalize a lot of responsibility for that. So if you look at the various types of cluster B personality disorders, you can see that the narcissistic personality disorder, this is a person who typically is self-centered. They feel entitled. They can be very charming. They like to get their own way, so they like to be right. As long as things are going their way, they tend to be okay. As soon as something doesn't go their way, then they can become very angry. So there is such a thing as narcissistic rage. And so they can go from being seemingly very calm and charming to being very upset and very angry if something doesn't go their way. So you have to be quite firm with them and help them to manage their emotions. They do tend to like compliments, so you can develop good rapport with a narcissist with compliments because they like to be admired. And that certainly can be a way to, if you can find things that you can say about them that are positive, that will help to build a good therapeutic relationship. Okay. So the next one would be the borderline personality disorder. They often have a deep fear of abandonment, which is usually due to childhood trauma. They can be controlling and manipulative in an indirect fashion, sometimes direct, but more often indirect. They can suffer from mood swings. Once again, they can exhibit splitting type of behavior. So they can idealize you as the counselor or therapist. During the honeymoon period, they will keep telling you what a wonderful person you are. Sometimes you get drawn in by that. Think, wow, this is such a wonderful client to work with. But then when something gets triggered in them, and then they go to the opposite extreme, where now it's your fault, they're really angry with you, they're disappointed in you, and they're critical of you. So don't get too drawn in by the wonderful accolades you may get from a borderline. Once again, it's important to stay calm when they become emotionally upset, which definitely is going to happen. You can give them reality checks when they are very emotional. Once they calm down, you can get them to review the situation more logically. You need to give them time and space to process their feelings, but at the same time, let's say if you're in an office with them and you're having a counseling session and they get really upset, you may want to help them to find ways to soothe themselves and for you to soothe them as well. I found sometimes, for example, by saying to a borderline, can I move my chair more closer to you so that I can hear you more clearly? And they often will say, yes, of course, because they appreciate that contact or that closer intimacy. And that helps them to calm down as well. The antisocial personality disorder, these folks are the most challenging. They can be dangerous sometimes. They tend to abuse alcohol and drugs, and some are sociopaths. They take advantage of people, and they tend not to follow the rules. They have an inner fear of being dominated, and so they dominate as a compensation for that. They can be charming and yet deceitful, and they can seek revenge for past injustices. So these folks are very difficult to work with therapeutically. You have to be very, very firm with them. You have to write out the rules for them. I have a written contract that I give to my parents. It's 11 pages long, and it's very, very detailed. And all the rules are there. They have to sign off on it. They have to get legal advice on it. Because I know that there will be times when I can have to come back to that contract and say, see, page 3, this is what you agreed to, remember? And then, then they don't really have a leg to stand on in that way. So you've got to keep the antisocial person accountable. You have to often be direct with them. You often have to confront them with their behavior and the effects it's having on other people. And you have to use, I think, more of a behavioral approach with them as opposed to an insight type of approach or a traditional counseling kind of approach. The histrionic is, they tend to be very dramatic. They enjoy attention, especially being the center of attention. They tend to be emotionally needy, and at times they can be seductive and provocative. They may appear on the outside to be quite confident, but inside they're usually quite insecure. And they often try to convince you that they are victims. Once again, with these folks, you can do some insight-oriented therapy with them, and once they get better at emotional regulation, identifying what triggers them is important for them to learn about, and what their emotions are trying to tell them, and as well helping them to develop a more of a reality-based perspective on situations that may trigger them. And then there's sociopathy, which I mentioned, and then subclinical. So you have people without full-blown personality disorders, but they certainly have symptoms at a subclinical level that you may become aware of as time goes on. Okay, so I'm going to show you a video now by Childress. I did send you a reference list after the first workshop, and you should have some of his books on that list. Craig Childress is a psychologist he's a bit of a maverick in the sense that he decided to very clearly define parental alienation using an attachment-based model. And he came up with quite a clearly laid out model, which actually is very helpful for severe cases and some moderate cases, because it really gives you a roadmap for assessment and for matching treatment to your assessment results. So this video is him talking actually to rejected parents. He's a bit of a maverick in that he's critical of the mental health system and the social services system for not responding more effectively to folks with personality disorders and also who are subclinical level and who are able to continue to alienate without being held accountable or getting proper treatment. So let's watch the video and then we can answer any questions or hear any comments from you.
Hello, I'm Dr. Craig Childress. Thank you for joining me for this series of YouTube videos. In this video series, I'm talking to you, the targeted parent, the child's authentic parent, regarding our efforts to rescue and recover your children from the psychological and developmental child abuse that's parental alienation. Let me begin by explaining the nature of the problem you're facing, and then I'll explain the solution. Your problem is twofold. First and most importantly, you cannot protect your children. Until we can protect your child, we can't ask your child to expose his or her vulnerability, his or her authenticity, to the vicious retaliation that's sure to follow from the narcissistic borderline parent, from your ex. If your child ever exposes his or her authentic love for you, if your child shows any love for you, or simply doesn't reject you completely enough, with enough display of anxious fearfulness or enough angry venom, then your child will face a withering psychological retaliation from the narcissistic borderline parent, from your ex. Your child is being held as a psychological hostage. They're being forced to say and do things that are contrary to their authenticity. Unless we can first rescue your children, unless we can first protect your children, we can't ask them to reveal their authenticity to the psychological brutality of the narcissistic borderline parent. And their hostage taker, the narcissistic borderline parent, is more powerful than you are. They're able to completely disempower you. You're made helpless. You're not able to rescue your children from them. So your child must do whatever he or she must do in order to survive in the dangerous psychological world in which they must live. You cannot rescue them. You're powerless to rescue them. So they must do what they must. They must reject you in order to survive psychologically in the dangerous world in which they've been abandoned. Parental alienation is not a child custody issue. Oh no, it's a child protection issue. Until we can protect your children, we cannot ask them to reveal their authenticity and the authenticity of their love for you. It's too dangerous for them in the hostage world in which they live. You must first protect your child. This isn't a battle against parental alienation. This is a battle for your children. This is a fight to protect your children, to rescue your children. I'm often asked by parents, what can I do to restore my relationship with my child? But that's the wrong question, and it portrays that you don't really understand the nature of the problem. If your child shows their authentic love for you, if your child doesn't reject you with sufficient display, they'll face a withering psychological retaliation from your ex, from the narcissistic borderline parent. You're essentially asking me, Dr. Childress, help me to more fully expose my child to their psychological child abuse. I won't help you do that. We must first protect your children. That's our first obligation. Then and only then can we ask your children to become authentic once more. Only when we're able to protect your children can we ask them to show their love for you. The first obligation of an authentic parent is to protect your children. Your children are being held hostage, and they're being psychologically abused. You must rescue your children from their emotional and psychological abuse. But you can't. You cannot protect your children, and that's your first problem. But why can't you protect your children? You love your children dearly. You want to protect them. You're fighting to protect them, but you can't. Why not? Because the systems that should be your allies in protecting your children, the mental health system and the legal system, have abandoned you. They're broken systems. Without them, you don't have enough power to protect your children, to rescue your children from their psychological abuse. That's your second problem. You're powerless to protect your children because the systems you need to enact that protection have failed you. Chief among these systems is the mental health system. It's the mental health system that should recognize the pathology. That's our job. It's the mental health system that should recognize the psychological child abuse. But they haven't. The mental health system has abandoned you and your children to their abuse. And that's unconscionable. In order to protect your children, you'll also need the power of the legal system in order to enact the rescue of your children from their hostage taker. Only the legal system has the power to order the rescue of your children. But the legal system has also failed you. It bleeds you of money, but to no avail. It too abandons your children to their abuse. Without the support of the mental health and legal systems, you don't have the power to protect your children from their emotional and psychological abuse. And if you cannot protect your children, you cannot recover your children's authenticity. Your children must sacrifice their authenticity to the narcissistic borderline parent in order to psychologically survive with the pathology of this parent. In order to solve parental alienation, you must first be able to protect your children. Parental alienation is first and foremost a child protection issue. In order to protect your children, you must have the support of the mental health and legal systems. Without their support, there's nothing you can do. Without the support of the mental health and legal systems, you are powerless to protect your children. And if you're powerless to protect your children, then your children must do what they must in order to survive in the psychologically dangerous world in which they've been abandoned. The solution is that we must fix the broken systems so that you are empowered to be able to protect your children. Once you have the power to protect your children, once you're able to rescue your children from their psychological and emotional abuse, then, and only then, can we recover your children's authenticity. That's why you're all in this together. We cannot solve this for any one family unless we solve it for all families. We first need to fix the systems that disempower you from protecting your children. We must first reclaim the mental health system as your ally in fighting the pathology, and then use the power of this new ally to obtain from the legal system the protection your children need. As long as the mental health system abandons you and your children, you'll have no power in the legal system. If you have no power, you'll be unable to protect your children. And if you cannot protect your children, then you cannot ask them to reveal their authentic love for you. If they reveal their authentic love for you, their hostage taker will exact a terrible revenge on them. If you ask your children to reveal their love for you, yet you cannot protect them, then you are simply exposing them more fully to their abuser. You must first protect your children, but you cannot do this alone. You alone cannot change the mental health system. You wait for someone to rescue you, as your children wait for someone to rescue them, but no one comes. Why doesn't anyone come to rescue you? Which is the same question your children are asking. Why doesn't anyone come to rescue them? You must come to rescue your children. But how can you rescue your children? You're just one person alone and powerless against the systems that won't listen, won't act. Nonsense. You are more powerful than you know, but not alone. We cannot rescue your children, your family, if we do not fix the mental health response to parental alienation. And when we fix the mental health response, we'll fix it for all children, for all families. We cannot rescue your individual child until we rescue all of the children. We're all in this together. There is your power. Don't ask me, what can I do to regain my child's love? Ask me instead, what can we do to protect our children? For 7 years, I've worked for you and your children towards this day. I've forged for you a tool, a way, a weapon to use in the fight for the recovery and rescue of your children, to protect your children. I'm not your warrior, I'm your weapon. But don't look for someone to rescue you, because then you're helpless, then you're a victim. No, with the right weapon and proper strategy, you're strong enough and powerful enough to rescue your children from their abuse. Are you kidding me? You're fighting for your children. You are fierce and determined. You are powerful when you come together. In this video series, I'll describe for you the weapon you have available to you in reclaiming your children. And I'll describe for you the strategy you can use to recover mental health as your ally, so that you can then protect your children and recover your authentic children, all of your children. Because only if we rescue and recover all of your children will we be able to rescue and recover your specific child. You must understand this, and this is critical. We're all in this together. We cannot solve parental alienation in one case for any one specific child or any one specific family unless we solve parental alienation for all children and all families. And when we solve it for all families, we solve it for your specific family, for your specific child. And this is important too. You cannot wait for someone to rescue you. You're not a victim who needs to be rescued. You are the child's authentic parent who needs to rescue your child. You're not a victim in need of being rescued. You're the hero who will do the rescuing. You are fierce and determined and powerful. All you need is the right weapon and the right strategy, and you are an unstoppable force. You are fighting for your children. And there's no more powerful force on this planet than an authentic parent who is fighting for your children. You are unstoppable. All you need is the right weapon and the right strategy. And that's what I'm going to give you in this series of videos. The coming battle is to recover mental health. Once mental health is your ally, we'll turn next to the legal system to recover your power to protect your children. When mental health speaks with a single voice, the legal system will be able to act with the decisive clarity necessary.
So I just want to say that when I first viewed that video, I was a little shocked by how strong his opinions are regarding the system and how he is, such a strong advocate for rejected parents. So I was a little taken aback by it because I haven't heard anyone in the field speak so strongly and take such a strong position on this. And yet I can see that some of what he's saying is valuable, is true, and action needs to be taken on it. So it's, but as I said, he's a bit of a maverick. He's not like many of the other folks in this working in this field. He wouldn't, I haven't heard too many other people take such a strong view and position on this issue. All right, so moving on to the next slide. Dynamics in the alienating family. So alienating parents. No, go back, Wesley, you had the right one there. Yeah, there we go, okay. So this is kind of a list of typical alienating parent behaviors and intentions or motives. So most alienating parents do see the child as needing protection, even if they themselves are suffering from delusions that somehow the other parent is an unsafe parent. And they actually believe some of their delusions, but their intention is to protect in most cases. Although sometimes it can be revenge. Revenge is certainly another motive that you will find with more severe cases. They express hostility directly and indirectly, which may include a desire for vengeance. Now, I find that sometimes there can be a difference, a gender difference. I find that most often men express their aggression, hostility directly, and women tend to express it more indirectly in a more passive way, passive-aggressive way. Obviously, you can't generalize to everyone, but that's been my general clinical experience. The alienating parent may view themselves as a victim abandoned by the rejected parent. And often alienation cases that tend to escalate very quickly is after there's been a humiliating, embarrassing kind of incident that has humiliated the favored parent. And so they quickly go into feeling like they are the victim and expressing their hostility towards the other person. They also may experience abnormal and prolonged grief reactions, sometimes even several years, excuse me, sometimes even several years after the separation. They may still be able to recall in detail what happened around the separation, their feelings about it. They just have a lot of difficulty letting go. They externalize responsibility. So very rarely are you going to hear them, at least in the initial stages of therapy, say that they have a part to play. Even if they say they have a part to play, they will find a way to blame the other parent. They will say, well, I'm just reacting to the other parent. If they didn't do that, I wouldn't have to react in the way I do. Often, if you go back into their family of origin, they have various kinds of family of origin issues. We're beginning to realize that alienating parents often have a history in their family of origin of cutting off relationships. There are a number of relationship cutoffs within their family system. And they may also have experienced some relatives who also were involved in alienation types of dynamics. They often have a history of failed romantic relationships. So if they feel abandoned by the rejected parent, they may go one way or the other. They may engage in a number of serial romantic relationships in an effort to make up for the loss, or they may withdraw from having any romantic relationships, and then they become more dependent on the child emotionally to fulfill their needs. If they go the first way, which is to bring in a number of failed or a number of romantic relationships, serial romantic relationships, they then often expose the child to new partners over and over and over again. And the child is expected to attach to each new partner as they come along. And the alienating parent may even start moving their residence around in response to what their new partner wants. So the child gets moved around from school to school to school. They often want to be in control and will do many different things to stay in control. So some of the verbal and emotional kinds of abuse that they will inflict on the rejected parent include denigration and contempt. If you read some of the text messages, a lot of contemptuous language, a lot of denigration. I'm sure you've probably read those kinds of communications yourself, but certainly as a parenting coordinator, I read that stuff all the time. Vilification of the target parent, partner, extended family. So they, once again, they're finding fault. They may label them in various ways. They interfere with their parenting time. They may show up late for parenting time, delivering the child in the transition. They have all kinds of creative ways of doing that. Say the child's not feeling well. They'll say, well, this is really my parenting day, it's not yours. And they've deliberately mixed up the schedule. They also tend to interrogate the child after the child's come back from the rejected parents for a visit. They often exaggerate incidents, and sometimes they will be outright lies. They will often make inappropriate disclosure about the targeted parent to the child. Common scenario would be they will show them court documents, have them they will read affidavit material to them. They will make up stories about them. Well, the other parent has had this outside of the relationship, inappropriate relationship, and they will tell the child about that. So some other tactics are they will encourage child defiance. Sometimes I've heard parents say on a phone call to the other child or to the child on the phone when the other parent is, when they're with the other parent, the rejected parent, and the alienated parent will say, no, you don't have to listen to what he says to you about that. No, you don't have to go to bed at 8 o'clock. You go to bed at 9 o'clock at my house. So you don't have to go to bed that early. So they will do that kind of stuff. They will pressure the child to be loyal. They encourage the child to be overly dependent, particularly where there's a lot of enmeshment. The alienated parent will teach the child that really they aren't that competent in being able to do things that are developmentally appropriate for that child. So the child then begins to depend on them to do things. They may use negative consequences and rewards. So if the child comes back and tells them negative stories about the rejected parent, the alienating parent will be happy about that, and they will join in with the child's negative story. Oh, gee, how could he do that? How could she do that? That's terrible. They may, if the child comes back and says something positive, they may punish them in various ways. I remember working with some adult children of who had been alienated, and they would talk about how they would come home, and if they said anything about the rejected parent, the other parent would give them the silent treatment, and would even tell them to go to their room. They're also very good at manipulating professionals, police, ministry, therapists, courts. If you don't have your wits about you, then you can easily get taken in by their stories, because they often can come across as very believable. So that's why you need to really corroborate what they say and get details from them about their stories. I find police response really varies. Sometimes the police attending the scene, if it's a domestic violence incident, or the child is refusing to go with one parent and there's a police enforceable clause. Police sometimes can be very, very good in that situation, and other times they can do things that make the situation worse. I probably don't have to say too much about the ministry, but you know, it varies, I'm sure, from team to team, from social worker to social worker, in terms of their awareness of this issue and their knowledge about how to intervene. Therapists, in particular, child therapists, can be very vulnerable to making the situation worse if, for example, they don't work as part of a team model. They're only working with the child individually, and if they're not really aware of how an alienated child can present, they can get taken in by their stories and reinforce it. And then, of course, the courts can make the situation worse in a variety of different ways. And it's getting better, though. I mean, judges are becoming more aware of alienation dynamics and how important it is to maintain an attachment between both parents and the child. So it is getting better, but you can still get court decisions and court orders that you look at them and you say, this doesn't even make sense, right? This is going to make the situation worse. So you actually have this article in your package. I just wanted to say a little bit about it, but it's a tactic often used by alienating parents. So Shelley Polak and Michael Saney, they're in Toronto, and it's a very, very good article, very comprehensive. But they focused really on gatekeeping. So open gatekeeping is where the child can go back and forth between the two homes without much restriction or tension between the parents. The parents work really well together. Closed gatekeeping, the child goes back and forth, but with some restrictions. So that could be because of a parenting plan, a separation agreement, a court order. So that doesn't necessarily mean that there's alienation going on. It's just that there are some restrictions to how the child goes back and forth. Now, maladaptive versus adaptive gatekeeping. Maladaptive gatekeeping would be unreasonable actions on the part of the alienating parent to keep control of the situation, and to they can gatekeep information about the child. They withhold that. They can once again change the schedule without notice. They can make plans with the child without notice. So there can be a lot of maladaptive gatekeeping. Adaptive gatekeeping comes from a positive protective response. This is where the rejected parent maybe does have some parenting deficits. There may be a history of some child protection issues. And so the parent who's the primary caregiver uses adaptive kinds of gatekeeping tactics. Protective versus malicious, I think that's fairly easy to understand. Rigid versus flexible, control and power imbalances. But when gatekeeping is really being used to serve the interests of the parent rather than the child, then it's definitely an alienation tactic that needs to be changed in a variety of ways. So we're going to look at dynamics in the alienated family. So this is generally how targeted or rejected parents tend to present, and some of the issues that you need to deal with in therapy with them. So they tend to be somewhat unassertive or people pleasers. They often feel helpless and powerless. Now, prior to the separation, I find this in a number of cases where they will report pre-separation that they had difficulty meeting the expectations of their their partner at the time. And that post-separation, the same dance goes on. They still feel like they can't meet their expectations, that the alienating parent is continuing to find fault with them, is continuing to be critical of them, accusing them of various things to do with their parenting. And so they find themselves in the same part of the dynamic where they feel helpless, they feel like they're on the defensive most of the time. This is something else maybe perceived by the alienating parent as uninvolved. I often find that being reported actually by the primary care parent where there's an alienation dynamic. They will insist that the other parent really didn't do anything with the child, even from the time the child was born, that they always had to be the primary parent. And then when you start digging into it and getting more details, like, well, you mean he never changed a diaper? You mean he never fed the child? You mean he never played with the child? Then they'll say, well, not exactly. I mean, I guess he changed a few diapers or whatever. So you need to dig into that and start poking some holes in that narrative, because a lot of the time it's not the case. They may have done more of the parenting during certain stages of the child's life, and then the other parents did more of the parenting during certain stages of the child's life. But it may not be true that they are just an uninvolved parent. But that will be used by the alienating parent as a reason for the child not to see them. Well, they've never been involved with them, so why does he want to be involved with them now? Also, the targeted parent has a fear of losing their children, which leads to accommodating the demands. So they will sometimes give in to the alienating parent, thinking, well, if I put up with the bullying, maybe the bully will go away. Doesn't happen, gets worse. Risk of high emotional distress. They can be obsessed with seeing their children. These folks are, they have a high level of distress, particularly if they're not having any contact with their children. And they can become obsessed with that. They can think about the child all the time. They're kind of stuck in a grief reaction, and they don't know how to get out of that. So it's a really important therapeutic issue to deal with. They also can become obsessed to the point where they mortgage their house, they sell their car, they do all kinds of stuff in order to keep the court fight going. And often they will feel guilty if they stop fighting in court. They will feel like they've abandoned their child. Counter-rejecting behavior. So the counter-rejecting behavior sometimes can present in the form of aggression of various kinds. It can be passive kind of aggression. It can be a direct kind of aggression. And these folks need to be educated and coached about how to stop counter-rejecting behavior and how to respond to the child in a different way, a more constructive way, because the counter-rejecting behavior just pushes the child away and also gives them ammunition to go home to the alienating parent and say, oh, look what so-and-so did or said to me, right? So it's not a good way of dealing with it, but it's understandable. Okay, we've got another video. This is by Richard Warshak, and it's on the experiences of the rejected parent. Richard Warshak was one of the founders of Family Bridges, which is a program in California where the alienated child and the rejected parent are ordered by the court to go and spend, I think they have a 4 or 5 day program. It's a combination of psychoeducation and counseling. And they've evaluated their program a number of times, and they've come up with very, very high success rates in terms of reunification. Sometimes it's not always easy to get the child and the rejected parent actually to the program because the alienating parent will often block any court applications to have it happen and will delay a lot. And sometimes the child even has to be accompanied by 2 mental health professionals who will take them from the courthouse, if the judge orders it, take them from the courthouse right to the plane where they're flown down to California, where they meet the rejected parent. The alienated parent is not allowed to attend the program. So Family Bridges claims that it's very, very effective, that usually within the first day, the child and the parent have now reunited and the child is acting normally with the rejected parent, which goes back to what Craig Childress was saying. If you provide safety and protection, then the child's authentic self can emerge. So the love that they have for that parent and the attachment they have with that parent can reemerge. So there's something to be said for that.
We've learned about.
Can you see my screen? Oh.
Yep, we can. Yep.
Alienated children and favored parents. But what about rejected parents? How does it feel to be Plutoed, to lose your family and your role as a parent?
Rejected parents feel devastated when their children refuse to spend time with them, stop expressing affection and respect for them. They haven't been prepared for this level of rejection, and they're stunned by it. Oftentimes they're embarrassed, and they worry that others are going to think, gee, you must have done something really bad if your kids don't want to spend time with you. People stop them on the street and ask how their children are doing, and rejected parents don't know because they are not being kept included in the children's activities. And they're very embarrassed. They don't know what to say. They usually try to change the subject. It's psychologically devastating to a parent to have the children that you loved and raised want to have nothing to do with you.
If alienation has been a problem in your family, the rejected parent probably feels most ashamed when ignored or shunned in front of others, such as at school or sports events. When people ask about their children, rejected parents often feel terribly embarrassed, even ashamed. They worry that others secretly think, there must be more to the story. I wonder what they did wrong to deserve their children's disrespect. Parents who have been rejected may begin to doubt themselves. They might ask, did I do something wrong? Maybe I'm not such a good parent.
It's very sad for a rejected parent when they see other parents enjoying their children because it reminds them of all that they're missing out on. They feel like shadows, ignored. They feel shunned by their children, and it's humiliating to them.
If one of your parents is rejected, they're probably trying to figure out how to deal with this. Should I give up? Should I be tough? Walking away feels wrong, even though this might create peace. Hanging in there seems right, but maybe the emotional cost to you and them is just too much to bear. As a result, and you may have noticed this, these parents often act inconsistently. Sometimes they withdraw and seem passive and uninterested in being with you. Other times they try hard to be involved, maybe even going to court, calling the police, or insisting that everyone see a therapist. It may seem like they do too much or too little, which might make them seem unreliable.
In some families, after repeated attempts to reconnect with the children, a rejected parent may get so discouraged that they enter into a state that we call learned helplessness. All their attempts to solve the problems, all their attempts to reach out to their children fail, and they don't know what else to do, and they begin feeling utterly helpless to change the situation. They may feel that they have no alternative but to withdraw from the children, to stop trying. Unfortunately, for some children, when their rejected parent stops trying to see them, the children actually feel abandoned by that parent because they've never really lost the love they felt for that parent. And the children may then think, gee, maybe that parent doesn't deserve our love. If he wouldn't hang in there and continue to try to see us. They may misunderstand the parent's withdrawal not as a sign that the parent just didn't know what else to do and felt helpless to solve the problem. They may misunderstand and think that that's a sign that the parent doesn't love them enough. In some situations, particularly when there have been multiple attempts to heal the relationship between children and the rejected parent, and these attempts all fail, there may be no better alternative than to at least accept the situation as it is and temporarily stop trying to heal, stop trying to reconnect, with the hope that sometime in the future the time will be right for the children to recover their love and restore a positive relationship with the parent.
Rejected parents often ask others for advice on how to manage this difficult situation. Sometimes well-meaning friends and relatives encourage parents to respond with anger. You need to teach your ex a lesson. Or how dare your children treat you like that? This can lead parents to overreact in ways that don't help. If your parent responds this way, it might drive you further away rather than make you want to repair the relationship. In fact, rejected parents sometimes need to be reminded that all kids complain about their parents from time to time. Just because a child is moody or negative doesn't automatically mean that the child is becoming alienated. Rejected parents seek advice from professionals, such as lawyers and psychologists.
Rejected parents are often told that the best way to handle their children's rejection is to allow a cooling off period, allow the children to withdraw for a while, wait for the right time to come when the children will reach out to reconnect with you. But unfortunately, in many families, the right time never comes. And what began as an alienation, where the children had negative attitudes about the parent, becomes a total estrangement where the children lose all contact with that parent. One of the most important things for a rejected parent is to try to stay in touch with the children. Try to maintain contact. Now, this may mean having to develop a thick skin, because when the children are with you, they may treat you with contempt and with disrespect. But we found that it's easier to help children recover a positive relationship if they spend time with you and if they get to see that the rejected parent still loves them and is not giving up.
So what can rejected parents do? In the words of Winston Churchill, never, never, never give up. Not giving up, though, requires persistence and understanding, and your parents may not have a lot of that left if they've been rejected over and over. When they lose their patience, and nearly every parent does from time to time, parents make mistakes. The favored parent might exaggerate these mistakes to make it seem like the rejected parent always acts impatiently, or that this is why the children don't want to spend time with the parent.
When children treat a parent so disrespectfully, most often the parent is not at all prepared to deal with that effectively, and they react by overreacting. They get very angry, they lose their temper, they ask the children, "How dare you speak to me that way?" But they can frighten the children when they do that, and then the children can use that as another reason for rejecting the parent, because the parent actually has yelled at them, has been aggressive, and maybe scared the children. In other cases, rejected parents will tell the children, "If you don't enjoy spending time with me, why don't you leave this home and come back when you can be more positive?" And unfortunately, the children may use that as a reason not to see the parent. They'll throw those words back to the parent. "Well, you said you didn't want to see us." And what begins as a parent's effort to improve the relationship and solve the problem can really be the beginning of the end of the relationship. It's very important that rejected parents avoid overreacting to their children and avoid rejecting their children. This means they've got to develop a thick skin, and they've got to develop patience to tolerate what is very disrespectful and contemptuous behavior without losing their temper.
If your parent overreacts, you might worry that this will happen all the time, or you might think that your attitude finally made your parent stop loving you. Secretly, you might even worry that you are no longer someone who is worth caring about. Another common mistake rejected parents make is to lecture about right and wrong, fair and unfair. While the lesson might be true, lectures rarely work. The more they try to tune you in, the more you try to tune them out. If you've been rejecting a parent, you may be frustrated when it seems like they minimize your concerns and complaints. A rejected parent might say, "Oh, you don't really feel that way," or "That's just your other parent talking, those aren't your real feelings." This too doesn't work. It could make you feel that your parent doesn't care or doesn't take you seriously. If you and a parent are alienated from one another or becoming alienated, it is certainly important to talk about what's going on. But one mistake that rejected parents make is to try to show their concern by asking a lot of questions. This often backfires rather than helps. If you've experienced this, the questions are likely to make you feel interrogated rather than cared about. And it may feel like their questions imply criticism, not at all what your parent wants you to feel. Another mistake that some rejected parents make is to counter all the bad-mouthing by saying bad things about the other one. This makes children feel bad and only makes things worse. But rejected parents shouldn't be reluctant to set the record straight when children say things that are wrong or unfair. Your children need help to deal with complaints they hear about you. For instance, a child says, "Mommy says you didn't spend much time with us and we never had any fun together." You can respond, "Mommy's mistaken." Remind the children of specific things you've done for them and with them. Bring out family videos and photos showing better times together.
When a rejected parent overreacts to the children, it's very important for the parent to acknowledge that they made a mistake and to apologize for it. It can be very difficult for a rejected parent to do that, though, because they feel they've been treated so unfairly. The children have been so disrespectful and treated them with such utter contempt that the rejected parent has a hard time acknowledging that he or she contributed to the children's conflict. But it's important that they acknowledge their mistake and take responsibility for it.
We've already said that rejected parents should never give up. Their children are worth fighting for. But what else can they do to help? We'll have more to say about this later in the program, but here are a few tips. First and foremost, rejected parents should remember that their children are victims. They didn't want this mess, they just got caught in it, and are doing their best to cope with something they don't fully understand. Second, rejected parents should hold back from arguing and criticizing when their angry children invite them to argue and criticize. It's important to remember that being in a relationship is more important than being right. Rejected parents need to develop a thick skin to withstand all the hurtful things their children say and do. Third, rejected parents should watch and wait for unexpected opportunities to help their children. Big school projects or medical problems offer opportunities to show interest, caring, and concern. When rejected parents make mistakes, they're acting like all parents do from time to time. Even parents who aren't rejected make some of these mistakes, especially when they're stressed. We hope your parents will learn from this program to avoid these traps. But keep in mind that parents are more than just their mistakes. Maybe it's time to cut them some slack.
So someone in the chat asked what the name of the video was. So it's Welcome Back Pluto. They've got a series of educational videos for parents. I would certainly suggest when you're dealing with a rejected parent that you show them this video, because it gives a very, very good outline of the mistakes that can be made and the things that they can do differently. Rejected parents really need a counselor / coach who can be emotionally supportive, empathic, and yet has good enough rapport that you can give them constructive feedback when they do make certain mistakes. Because these parents can be very distressed and they do need a lot of emotional support. I would also recommend, given that you have various programs within your agency, that you consider perhaps starting a support group for rejected parents. That could be where a social worker could refer clients to them, to that group. Once again, you could use a combination of psychoeducation, discussion, and it would be very helpful for rejected parents to hear that other people are in the same boat. There are also some YouTube videos by rejected parents who have successfully implemented some of the strategies that you see in the video. That can be very helpful for a rejected parent. Once again, they're hearing it from the horse's mouth that someone has actually been able to do this and navigate these very difficult waters. You could also consider a support group for alienating parents, but often with the resistance and the other things that are going on, that may not, you may not be able to get that off the ground, but it's something worth looking at, or a more general educational program involving all types of parents, not just someone who's been labeled as alienating. Although a social worker, if they do label a parent as alienating, could be referred to an educational program, counseling program. If they have not been labeled in that way, then you could have a more general program, just educating parents about the importance of maintaining attachments between the child and both parents, and the various kinds of alienating behaviors that can occur and counter-rejecting behaviors that can occur, which put more pressure on the child, and how to relate to children at different stages of development when you're getting resist, refuse types of dynamics starting to happen. So those are just some suggestions. Okay, we're gonna go a little bit while longer, then we'll take a break. Now with the alienating parents, I'll say a few more things about that. That's why we work in teams. So we have a coach and counselor for each parent, and we have a child therapist, and we all work together. There is no confidentiality between the therapists, so we can share information. And we develop a plan for each of the parents, and we develop a plan for the child after we do an assessment. And the reason I really like that way of working is that each of the parents has their own coach who can give them specific feedback about what they need to change, can give them emotional support, can encourage them to start to communicate with their co-parents. You could even have four-way meetings with the two coaches and the two parents. So there's a variety of different things you can do within that model that will help to offset some of the resist refuse dynamics. And I think I mentioned this before, but I did get the opportunity to attend with Dr. Barbara Fiddler when she did a residential, a 5-day residential program. And the transformation that took place was unbelievable. So it's doable, but you definitely need to think about being part of a team if that's possible within the resources that you have. Okay, so the alienated child tends to present as, well, we looked at Gardner's 8 criteria. So, I mean, they present with many of those types of symptoms, but they can be pretty rigid in their cognitive distortions. They can insist that that what they're telling you is true, and they've made up their mind, and no one can make them see the other parent. So they can come across as quite rigid, and so it's approaching them takes time and takes patience, and once again takes a variety of different strategies, because underneath all of that presenting facade that they will show you in the first few sessions is a child who's very scared. They are grieving over missing the rejected parent. They're scared that the alienating parent may disapprove of what they're doing. So they have a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety. And so initially you want to, once again, develop rapport and trust with that child. You want to listen to their complaints about the rejected parent. You want to question them about how that became a complaint, when it started, when it happens. So you want to get the details, which is a gentle way of kind of challenging some of their narratives. But it also gives you more information about how the child perceives the situation. And they may in fact fully believe that. They may know that they may not even be aware that they're not telling the truth. They may have come to believe that is the truth. And then there are other kids that kind of know that they're making up stories. And those children tend to be more susceptible to guilt, feeling guilty. So the first few sessions, you want to kind of explore their perceptions and look for opportunities maybe to engage them in a variety of different activities. You don't always want to be focusing on the fact that they're not seeing the rejected parent. You may want to listen to them about other issues that they have going on in their life. Maybe they're having difficulty making friends at school, or or they want to be involved in certain activities and they miss being in the activity. So you want to also expand the conversation to include all other areas of their life, because you want them to feel like this is a safe place where they can bring any issue that they want to bring to you for assistance. And then when there are opportunities to touch on the resistance to seeing the parent, then those are opportunities where you might be able to once again do some educating, show them a video, play a game. I gave you a whole ton of different resources that you can use with children, and there's tons of stuff online. So it's just a matter of how creative you want to be and what's going to work to engage that particular child. Okay, so let's move on. We'll get into more of that later, but that's sort of a general overview of the kinds of interventions. All right, so these are things that you need to consider when you're looking at treatment outcomes and the type of treatment that you may want to put into place or recommend for a particular family. So first of all, can the favored parent or the alienating parent, what kind of ability do they have to separate out their own thoughts or feelings from the child's needs, right? That's a huge one. And they will give you examples and situations where they're having difficulty doing that. And there will be other situations where they seem to have a clear ability to be able to say, yeah, well, that's my issue, my problem. That's not the child's problem, right? So I need to separate that out. But you'll certainly get to know their ability to do that over time. And you need to, once again, continue to bring to their attention, this is really about the child's needs. It's not about your needs. What is it that you can do to address your own issues versus going through the child to get your needs met? Another question, is there an intentional fabrication of domestic violence or abuse allegations? If there is, that certainly takes the alienation dynamic to a much higher level, which means they're engaging in a certain amount of dishonesty and deception, which may bring into question how honest and deceptive or how honest they're being with you in therapy in general. And the importance of pointing out to them that honesty really is the best policy, even if they've made a mistake. That's okay. Parents make mistakes, they don't need to engage in that kind of behavior. I would also bring it back to the child. If the child knew that you were making up allegations about the other parent, how would they feel about that, right? What are you teaching the child when you're doing that? Would you teach them to, if they didn't like a teacher, excuse me, if they didn't like a teacher, to make up a story about the teacher and lie about the teacher? So get them thinking about that. You want to identify as well, how much has the child identified and aligned with the favored parent? There's signs of enmeshment, role reversal. Is the anxiety in the child escalating? Are they becoming more and more anxious as time goes on, particularly regarding contact with the other parent? Are transition difficulties short-lived or problematic? And you may want to develop a plan with the parents to reduce conflict in front of the child at transitions. Is the child still seeing the rejected parent, or is there a cutoff? If there's a cutoff, it's a much more serious situation. At least if they're seeing the child, then there's a chance to start to build a relationship, even if it's under supervision or whatever. But if there's a complete cutoff, that's a much more serious situation. And then how many of Gardner's 8 criteria are present? Okay, and the last slide here, and then we'll take a break. So this is just for your information. So these are psychological measures that can assist in assessment of alienation and estrangement. So there's the what's called the PARC. You can find it online, the Parental Acceptance Rejection Questionnaire by Dr. Ron Rohner. It's a very good questionnaire that each of the children is given a questionnaire to fill out. Each of the parents is given a questionnaire. And it really helps to identify what the child's perceptions are of each of the parents. And this is where you'll tend to see splitting. If the child's perceptions on the questionnaire turn out to be idealizing one parent and having a lot of negative perceptions of the other parent, then that may be a sign that alienation is going on. I must say as well at this point that we don't have any one set of questionnaires or questionnaire that will identify different levels of parental alienation. You often have to use a variety of questionnaires that indirectly may suggest parental alienation. You also have to use a lot of parent-child observation and getting to know the family over time. So there's a lot of clinical assessment needs to be done. They're trying to come up with more instruments, more comprehensive instruments, but nothing really hits the mark so far. The co-parenting questionnaire, Dr. Benjamin Garber, you can also find that online. It really, it's a self-report. So each parent is able to answer questions about how well they're able to cooperate together. And once again, you can use that as an educational tool, getting them to look at what they need to change there. Changes in resist-refuse dynamics, Dr. Leslie Drodes, you've got that in your package. And it's a way, if treatment has been going on for a while, it's a way of assessing progress. Typical behaviors, perceptions, beliefs in PA cases, Dr. Barbara Fiedler and Dr. Nicholas Baha. Once again, it lists behaviors for, typical behaviors for the alienated child, alienating parent, and rejected parent. So once again, you can use that. You could even review it with the parents you're working with as to whether they believe any of those behaviors, they're engaging in any of those behaviors, or if they believe the other parent is engaging in any of those behaviors, or if they see those behaviors in the child. Typical behaviors for mild, moderate, severe cases. We'll review more of that later in the presentation. Diagnostic checklist for pathogenic parenting. So that's Dr. Craig Childress. That's in your package as well. It's a very, very good diagnostic instrument if you're dealing with severe cases, because it gives a lot of very specific examples that you once again can review with your clients. Okay, so any questions before we break for 20 minutes? I'm seeing one here. Let me just go to the chat room. Okay, let me see if I can. Okay, so this is from June. It sounds like children who have been brainwashed come to believe the stories the alienating parent tell them. Do other areas of their cognitive abilities get compromised as a result of this experience? For instance, their ability to make friends and see and hear things in other areas in their life in an unbiased way. I would say generally no. However, if the child is experiencing trauma as a result of the parental conflict, or they're experiencing trauma as a result of the brainwashing, which they likely will, I find trauma generally impacts all areas of the child's life. So they may lose confidence, they may have more anxiety, they may tend to withdraw more, their school functioning may go down. So I would look for the effects of trauma, for sure. In your years of working with AP families, have you ever come across a family where the AP stops the alienating behavior for one reason or another without professional intervention, and the children reunite with the rejected parent? Yes, the behavior may stop. Once again, if you're dealing with a personality disorder and they're hell-bent on eradicating the child from the other parent's life, they're only going to stop when the alienation has fully taken hold. So they've accomplished their purpose. Then they will stop. But otherwise, they'll keep going until they get what they want. If you have other alienating parents who aren't suffering from psychopathology, there have been cases where they will see, as a result of therapy and education, that they will see that, okay, they need to do some things differently, or they may just come to that conclusion themselves. We don't really know how many people engage in therapy where there's resist-refuse dynamics out of the total number of cases that actually occur. So another good question. When a child is cut off with the rejected parent, what can be done to help reconnect the child and the rejected parent? Most of the time, you need to get involved in some kind of a court order. It needs to be a court order, or the threat of a court order. Sometimes just the threat will get the rejected or the alienating parent to change, particularly if they know they're going to have to spend a heck of a lot of money on court costs. Sometimes if they're healthier people, then they will see that, that's not really good for the child. They will actually see that the child is suffering, and they may voluntarily negotiate a plan with the other parent for some kind of contact. And certainly in mediation, you can deal with mild and moderate cases in that way, where you can negotiate a plan for reconnection. Okay, so it looks like all.
Question,
Yeah,
Bob?
yes,
Or,
certainly, yes, go ahead.
hi, sorry. So I'm just wondering about, so there's a couple of things. For parents who just can't afford to continue with the legal costs
Mhm.
and can't afford to be doing private therapy, what
Yeah.
do you recommend for, like, I have a couple families that just don't have the money and the alienation is really severe.
Yeah.
So I just don't really know what to recommend to them. And also, for the child to get counseling, both parents have to consent in most cases.
Mhm.
And one of the alienating parent will not consent.
Right, okay. The first question is not an easy one to answer because the resources that we have are quite limited.
Yeah.
Now, a low-income parent can get legal aid, and they can put a court application for resumption of parenting time, or they can put a court application for against the other parent for breaking the court order. So legal aid certainly is an option for lower income folks, and for higher income folks that don't qualify for legal aid, it's a real problem because they do tend to run out of money, and they may not get satisfactory results for quite a period of time. They may not get a court order ordering counseling for quite a period of time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Although I must say that is changing. If a lawyer puts in an emergency application, and this is where lawyers can be helpful, even ones that you have to pay, they can do an emergency application, get in front of a judge and say, the child is not being seen by the parent, hasn't been seen by the parent for the last 3 weeks or a month. The other parent is making allegations that the child isn't safe with that parent, even though prior to that period of absence, the child was going back and forth without any problem at all, right?
Right.
So they may be able to convince the judge, okay, this is ridiculous. We're going to go back to the parenting plan. Or if the judge suspects there are some safety issues, the judge could order supervised parenting time by a family member, by a professional if it can be paid for. But what you really want to do is just get the contact going again.
Yeah.
As soon as possible, right? And judges now are getting to the point where they are starting to order that more often, and they're ordering counseling more often. So it is improving in that way, but there's no question, we need to have nonprofit agencies with teams of folks who can work together with high conflict families and can deal with alienation dynamics. And it's either on a sliding scale or free of charge. So that's where we need to go, I think.
Thank you.
So one of the key principles in the world of therapy is to use evidence-based therapy, which means that we try to match the type of intervention to the characteristics of the case or the family. Generally in counseling, there's certainly a lot more research that has been done and more evidence that we can rely on. In this area of therapeutic work, we don't really know much about what works, what doesn't work, how long the treatment effects might last if we get positive treatment effects. We don't really know what the failure rate is, the success rates. Individual programs are gathering some data on their own programs. We don't really have much data across programs or looking at a wide variety of different types of therapy and what effects it's having with this type of presenting issue. So once again, we have to fall back on our clinical skills and clinical assessment abilities. So what we do know, though, is in matching the intervention to the level of severity is that we can put it into 3 categories. So mild, moderate, and severe cases. And once again, this is based mainly on anecdotal evidence reported by clinicians. So the mild cases, the child shows few symptoms of resistance at transitions. They tend to go fairly easily with each parent going back and forth. However, particularly with younger children, they may have some separation anxiety, which is a normal developmental stage for young children anyway, particularly if they feel more attached to one parent than the other. But in the case where there's some resist-refuse dynamics that have been going on for a while, a mild case would be some symptoms, but tend to be fairly few symptoms and not too severe. Also, the child quickly becomes comfortable with the rejected parent. So once the child goes with that parent, sometimes children might cry a bit in the car, and then they settle down, they start to engage with the rejected parent, and they have a great time together after that. Also, in mild cases, the child continues to have contact with the extended family. They may still see both paternal and maternal grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. So that would be a more mild form. Gardner's symptoms are not usually present. So there may be times when the child is saying, I don't want to go see daddy, or I don't want to go see mommy. And that's happening on a more frequent, regular basis. But these other symptoms aren't appearing. So that's the time to take action when it first starts. And then you can nip it in the bud, so to speak. Moderate cases, Gardner's symptoms are present. There are increasing difficulties with transitions. So the child may cry before they get in the other parent's car, or they might, if there's an exchange at the residence of one of the parents, the child may refuse to come out at first. So definitely you can see the child's becoming increasingly anxious, and that's being displayed at the transitions. The child is initially guarded with the rejected parent, and then over time, sometimes rejected parents will say, well, it took them 3 or 4 hours, and then they started to become more themselves, and then they were fine, right? So the amount of time it takes for them to adjust to being with the rejected parent starts to increase. Also, the child may get anxious prior to returning to the favored parent, particularly if they're anticipating that the favored parent is going to be questioning them about what happened at the other parent's house, or there's going to be tension around what they disclose, what they don't disclose. The child may be feeling some guilt feelings and not quite sure what to do with that. So they may get anxious prior to going back. Severe cases, these are the ones that are the easiest to spot because they're all the classic symptoms. They are the Craig Childress type of cases. So all of the Gardner symptoms are present. The child refuses to see the rejected parent. The child may even threaten self-harm or harm towards the rejected parent. Sometimes the child is violent towards the rejected parent. There may be destruction of property. They might throw things, break things, and there's just incessant rejecting behaviors from the time they are with the rejected parent to the end of the visit, even if it's supervised by a professional supervisor or a family member. The child will act cold and distant from the beginning, and there will be very little change by the end of the visit. The child also tends to be hypervigilant, so you can see signs in them of guardedness, particularly in getting close to the rejected parent. So they really have an emotional wall up, and that shows in their behavior. Okay, the next slide. Okay. So what do you do with each of these levels of severity? So generally with mild cases, these are the ones that are the easiest to intervene with. Traditional forms of therapy tend to work fairly well. Mediation tends to work fairly well. Psychoeducation is usually very helpful. They tend to be compliant with the treatment plan or the treatment recommendations, the parents or the favored parent. And if there's a social worker or court directive, they tend to follow those. For the most part, they will follow the court order if there's a parenting plan or court order in place for parenting arrangements. They are also willing to meet with the co-parent, sometimes with a professional present, to facilitate communication. They will also facilitate some contact with the rejected parent. So they even may make a suggestion to the rejected parent. Well, why don't you take little Susie to her skating tonight, right? And then the two of you can have some time together. However, the favored parent still tends to be pretty anxious. They still are on guard in terms of feeling like they need to protect the child. They still tend to monitor and watch closely what the other parent is doing. The rejected parent is is easier to work with in the sense that they are capable of self-reflection, insight, and they also show some capacity to regulate anxiety. So with these cases, if you intervene and provide some co-parent facilitated communication, provide some psychoed, provide counseling support, the mild case may never become more than a mild case. That's the hope anyway. Now with moderate cases, now you're getting the favored parent starting to either say verbally some cognitive distortions, and they will either say that in front of the child, to the other parent. You'll see the cognitive distortions over and over again in affidavit material. They will often exaggerate the danger to the child of being with the other parent. They might warn the child, now be careful that that daddy doesn't leave you alone in this situation, because you know what he's done in the past. He can leave you alone, and then you're really scared. So even though there's no evidence that the father has ever left the child alone. So there's kind of an overprotective response. They also show signs of maladaptive gatekeeping that we talked about before. So sometimes they're unreasonable in negotiating parenting time and contact. They do, however, tend to cooperate with social worker and court directives. So that's certainly a plus. They can benefit still from psychoeducation, they usually get quite a bit out of that. Now the rejected parent may start to counter reject because they are getting frustrated. They're going into a grief response. And so they may become aggressive in a direct or indirect way. And they often have limited insight and ability to attune to the child, right? So there's lots of therapeutic work you can do there in terms of helping that parent to learn about attunement, what that means, to learn more about attuning to themselves in terms of their own emotions and feelings. So there's a lot that they can be taught within a therapeutic context, and you can also do some role playing with them around how to respond to the child's resistance in a more constructive way, and how to manage their frustration when they get triggered. So there's lots of stuff you can do with moderate cases as well. But moderate certainly is a greater degree of difficulty, usually requires a longer period of time to resolve it, and usually requires more resources. So in a mild case, you might be able to get away with a child therapist and a parent counselor. With moderate, you're more likely to need each parent to have their own coach and the child to have their own therapist. Severe cases, I mean, we've talked about that a fair amount. Usually a history of police and ministry involvement, history of no contact or only supervised contact. Often you'll see personality disorders, non-compliance, need for court orders for treatment, and in case of prolonged severe alienation, custody reversal may be quite appropriate. In my view, I think the courts are still, they still take too long to reach a decision around custody reversal. And this is once again assuming that there is substantiated evidence that the alienating parent is in fact on a campaign and is not likely going to stop anytime soon. So I would like to see courts take more firm action with that. I remember a case, this is quite a few years ago. This is before I actually started doing this work, but I had it was the mother that came in for counseling, and she said that she had separated from her husband recently, and he wasn't allowing her daughter to come and see her on weekends where they had agreed previously to do that. So she filed a court application, went to court pretty quickly, actually got in. And the judge, bless his heart, said to the father, okay, today is Friday. You're going to come back up here in front of me on Monday, and you're going to tell me about all the wonderful visits your daughter is having with the mother. And if you're not telling me that, then I'm going to have to consider other options, right? Wow. I thought, amazing. If only more judges did that kind of thing, we would cut through a lot of the BS. And well, guess what happened, right? The daughter had her visits with mom, and they carried on without it turning into a resist-refuse case. Okay, so here are some general goals and interventions for mild and moderate cases. So even with mild cases, you might get some distortions, cognitive distortions, not usually as much, but certainly with moderate cases you do. But one of the goals is to change people's perceptions. And what I do is I label that for people. I say, okay, these are your perceptions, right? That's your perception of reality. That's your perception of the child. That's your perception of the other parent, right? Now we need to look at whether there's any truth in that or not, right? And how you came to those conclusions. So you start to gently challenge them on their perceptions. And you do the same with an alienated child, right? You gently start to challenge them on their perceptions. So you can do that through parent education, individual, conjoint, group, online types of interventions. There's a variety of different things you can do there. Another goal would be to start to realign the relationships. Barbara Fiedler does that quite well through her program, her approach called multifaceted family therapy, which involves a team of therapists. They work with families on an outpatient and an inpatient basis or a residential basis, usually an intensive. Also, there's the program called Overcoming Barriers Camp, and you can get on their mailing list, so they'll send you emails of all the latest stuff that they have going, and they've got all kinds of resources you could look up. So look up Overcoming Barriers, Google it, and lots of stuff will come up around that. And usually with the realigning the relationships, you need to have a court order or ministry directive for moderate cases. Realigning relationships is not easy. It's not easily accomplished. I find that even though high conflict families appear on the outside to be very unstable, they are a very, 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 very stable family system. And I'll give you an example. So when I did that workshop with Barbara Fiedler and did the intensive with her team, as I said to you, from the beginning to the end of the intensive, there were huge changes in this family. Well, she sent me an email about a month ago giving me a follow-up on that case, which in fact I had done maybe 3 years ago. And I started reading through all the court stuff that she provided to me as a follow-up. These parents are right back where they started when we first started working with them. So they are very stable. It's a very stable family system and very difficult to change. So realigning relationships is a big challenge. Reducing anxiety and avoidance. So that's certainly something that can be taught to both parents and to the child, because there's often high levels of anxiety. And avoidance is usually the #1 coping mechanism that's used. So parents, for example, will avoid talking to each other. We've got a file right now where the mother says she would not ever sit in the same room with the other parent to talk about anything, even with therapists in the room. She absolutely refuses to do that, right? And then she wonders why 2 of the children are avoiding spending time with the other parent, right? So she's modeling and mirroring avoidance for the children. So it's all about anxiety and fear for her and for the children. So reducing that, helping them to look at things in a different way, reframe what they believe about situations, using your emotional regulation strategies, setting up a plan for desensitization so that the avoidance can gradually be overcome. And there's a variety of different ways of doing that as well. Very important, particularly for the child, to teach them critical thinking skills. Now, most younger children, let's say anywhere from 5 to 6 and younger, haven't typically developed critical thinking skills at that point. So they will tend, if they're going back and forth between the two homes, they will tend to adopt a narrative that is pushed at them in each home. Then when they go back to the other home, they revert back to the other narrative. So they haven't developed the ability to kind of analyze or see through the various narratives that they're being exposed to. Once again, there's CBT that you can use with older children, like probably when a child's 7, 8 years of age, and that's the age group that are most vulnerable to being alienated. Now they're beginning to develop an ability to think critically. So there are some CBD exercises you can do with them. There are just asking simple questions like, how did you come to that conclusion? What evidence do you have that that's true? Even getting them to read stories where they can analyze the story and analyze the characters in the story and how the characters have different perspectives on something can all be very useful in teaching about a variety of perspectives and critical thinking. Enhancing parenting skills. So although I know we looked at the continuum of different types of cases in part 1 of the workshop, where there was affinity, alignment, justified rejection, and unjustified rejection. We need to add to that hybrid cases, because hybrid cases involve some deficient parenting by the rejected parent. They need to maybe modify their parenting style. They maybe need to improve in some areas, like learning how to attune to the child. So it might be very appropriate to recommend parenting courses for them, because they're part of the problem. It's not just, in those hybrid cases, it's not just the alienating parent who's causing the rejection. The alienating parent is contributing, but they're not the primary cause necessarily. So, but also with the alienating parent, teaching them about, the importance of attachment, for example, and how when a child holds negative perceptions about the other parent, particularly when they're unsubstantiated, that damages the attachment, and that can damage their overall development, and then that can damage them as adults. And there's stuff you can give them to read around adult children of alienators who report their experiences as adults. Strengthen the co-parent functioning. So that's very important. So you might want to help the co-parents to set up a structure that is appropriate for them. So it could be a disengaged structure, could be parallel parenting, could be various rules and structures around certain parts of their parenting arrangements. And if you're in my work, if I'm doing the therapeutic part, I'm often working with a parenting coordinator who makes arbitrated decisions about rules and structure, which is very helpful. And then works with parents to make it a more functional co-parent unit. Step up parenting time. So that's often used with a desensitization treatment plan. You're gradually and slowly exposing the child to the rejected parent. It could start with something as simple as just exchanging some text messages, exchanging letters, emails, maybe going online or on the phone. So all of this, once again, would need to be monitored by a professional to make sure that the communication is constructive and is actually contributing towards a reconnection, and that the rejected parent isn't shooting themselves in the foot by responding in the wrong way, or the child is not allowed to be disrespectful. So you can start at the very low end of the continuum and gradually move up. As the child and the parents start to spend time together, you may want to look at the type of activities they do together. So if if the child chooses an activity and a location for the activity, then you may want to help the rejected parent and the child to choose an activity that starts off with, let's say, parallel play. So they don't have to actually look at each other or be close together at the beginning, if that in fact is triggering anxiety for the child. So that's something you kind of have to assess as they do different activities together. And then once again, you gradually work them towards activities where they maybe have to cooperate together, like cooperative games or playing in the park together or stuff like that. So there's a variety of different goals here and strategies that you may want to give some thought to. Okay, so indications and contraindications for treatment in mild and moderate cases. So how willing are the parents to accept guidance and to comply with your recommendations or the recommendation of the social worker or whoever is in that position or in that role? So if they lack insight and they're very resistant to feedback or accepting some kind of direction or recommendations, then I think your goal becomes, okay, how can we just, let's say it's an alienating parent. So how can we just protect this child from the alienating parent behaviors? Because it's unlikely the behaviors are going to stop. That might be where a role reversal is appropriate, or not a role reversal, custody reversal is appropriate. So you have to look at the person's ability to change and to absorb new feedback and a willingness to focus on the child's needs. So then the willingness of the alienating parent to participate in treatment. Often, if it's a more severe case, I would say moderate to severe cases, they often are very resistant to participating. They will say, it's not my problem. It's up to the child. The child can make the choice. And it's really the other parent that has to change because they've really hurt this child's feelings and they've done this and they've done that. So if there's some willingness there to participate in treatment and to become part of the solution rather than continuing to be the problem, then that's certainly a plus in terms of treatment outcomes and the ability to produce positive treatment outcomes. The willingness of the alienated parent to support the alienated child and rejected parent relationship. And what are the variety of ways in which they can support that, right? And at the same time, educating them about the ways that they undermine it. The ability to self-reflect and take responsibility. Not sure if you're familiar with the stages of change, but if you are, if a person does not have the capacity to self-reflect or is not in that stage of change and doesn't take responsibility, then they are what we call in the pre-contemplative stage of change. And there are various things that you can do to start to move them towards a contemplative stage of change where they have more self-awareness and more of an ability to take responsibility. So we all know that in therapy, if people can self-reflect and take responsibility, typically they are great clients to work with. So in this group, you get differing abilities for people to be able to do that, or even a willingness to do that. You also have to look at the risk of ongoing domestic violence when parents participate together. So if you're going to have a co-parent meeting, for example, even on Zoom or even virtually, is that going to trigger any trauma for either parent? And so how can they have contact without being triggered? Or do they need to do more individual work before they're ready for co-parent communication, at least in person? So you might have to encourage other kinds of co-parent communication that give them still some distance. Good example of that would be, the app called Our Family Wizard, where all the child's activities and appointments and all the financial stuff is put on one online forum where both parents can access it. So there's some kind of co-parent communication going on, but they don't have to have direct contact with each other. Ministry directive, that's certainly nice to have for CFCSA cases or a court order for counseling. There need to be sanctions or consequences if abuse doesn't stop or the parents withdraw from counseling. So in my contracts, for example, one of the terms I have is that both parents have to agree to a certain time frame of counseling. So usually I say a minimum of 6 months to a year. You have to work with the team for that period of time, and they have to sign off on it on a contract. Often, if it hasn't gone to court yet, I will tell the lawyers that I want them to make that a term of the order. And that other terms in the order might include that the alienating parent has to bring the child to counseling sessions, that both parents have to participate in individual counseling as well as conjoint counseling as directed by the therapist. You have, under the Family Law Act, you usually have to have terms around how they apportion fees and the financial part. So all of that has to be clearly laid out. And then a detailed parenting plan with high conflict families, that's very important. The more vague it is, the more they have reasons to fight. So the more detailed, the better. So those are things to consider when you are thinking about, do I want to take on this family in a treatment context? Okay, so goals and interventions for severe cases. So this is in Bob's ideal world. So in the CFCSA world, the social worker verifies the alienation as emotional child abuse, imposes appropriate sanctions such as no access for the alienated parent for a period of time, while the AP engages in counseling followed by supervised access. Project Parent is engaged, there's parent education, there's a communication plan for both parents, there's step-up parenting, there's child counselor with a counselor trained in PA, there's case management meetings to coordinate the counseling, and a treatment failure can trigger removal from the AP, okay? So that's Bob's perfect world. Who knows, maybe it's happening somewhere, but my understanding is it might happen in bits and pieces or partially, but not completely. But if you have all those elements in a treatment plan, then the chances of it being successful are much better. Now into the Family Law Act, not so easy peasy. So court involvement is required to verify the PA as abuse. So once again, you get a situation, a parent goes in, they hire a lawyer for a few hours, parent goes in, emergency application. The lawyer makes the case that the child isn't having any contact with their client and alleges that the other parent is blocking parenting time. The other parent's lawyer presents the case, well, the reason we're blocking parenting time is because the child's no longer safe with that parent. Okay, so then what does the court do? The judge may hear the evidence right there and may make a decision, or the judge may say, I don't have enough evidence, so I want section 211, or I want views of the child report, or I want some other evidence, right? Or we need to go to a hearing or a trial so I can hear evidence from various witnesses, and then I can decide if there's a safety issue. Obviously, if it's a more severe safety issue that's being alleged, then usually the ministry is already involved, has already been called, and maybe has already done an investigation, so the judge might look at that. If there's police involvement, there might be police reports to look at. But generally under the Family Law Act, things get delayed and delayed and delayed. And then the PA gets worse and worse and worse. So in Bob's ideal world, there would be court involvement required to verify that PA is in fact occurring, or maybe it's a hybrid case. Both parents need to be held accountable. There's a detailed court order for the counseling team and a step-up parenting plan. There's appointment of a parenting coordinator who can arbitrate and has legal authority. There would be reports back to the court by the PC and the counseling team. You would have the same judge for subsequent hearings, because that's something that happens as well. It delays is that you get a change in judges. You might go through 5 or 6 different judges on the same file. And then the decision-making and treatment planning is all over the map. There would be sanctions for non-compliance said by the judge in court. If you don't follow through, then you're going to come back in front of me and you're going to be asked to account for that. Treatment failure can result in a court order for more intensive residential treatment, such as family bridges, overcoming barriers, or there can be the threat of a custody reversal if things don't change. Okay, so I'll come back to that. Just want to cover some other stuff first. Okay, so now with severe cases of PA where counseling is not effective, if the rejected parent can once again shoot themselves in the foot by becoming really impatient and forcing more litigation, which of course just stirs everything up again. That's usually out of frustration. That's usually counter-rejecting kind of behavior. The alienating parent, they continue to make false, malicious allegations. Once again, you might be dealing with personality disorders that are untreatable or very difficult to treat. You might get interference from other professionals and extended family, right? This is what we call tribal warfare. So the tribes line up on either side, and then they start attacking each other. And they can stick their nose into a therapeutic intervention and really throw things off the rails. So you need to manage, you need to make contact with these other professionals, and you need to make contact with extended family members who have influence and power, and get them on board before you start the treatment process, because if they come back in later, then you may have a mess on your hands. Now, if custody reversal is the only viable option, then you have to assess, and the court may ask for an opinion on this, you need to assess whether this is going to be traumatic for the child to be pulled away from the alienating parent and now placed with the rejected parent, right? Is there a risk of more trauma or trauma happening, right? So that actually needs to be assessed before custody reversal actually happens, unless of course there are significant safety issues where the child just needs to be removed immediately. So their professional trained counselors can assist with this transition under the direction of the ministry, direction of parenting coordinator, or the court. The alienating parent can be ordered to take counseling as a condition for access, and they need to demonstrate change. So I was on a file one time where I was actually working with the alienating parent, and the children, he had not had access to the children for a number of months. And the court was requiring a report from me as to whether his attitudes and behavior changed sufficiently that he could be allowed direct contact with the children again. The alienated child and rejected parent are given a period of time prior to the AP having access. So for example, if the family goes through a period of counseling, it could be outpatient or even residential, and then immediately the child goes back to the alienating parent, and then everything you've been doing could just be undone. So even with Barbara Fiddler's case, the agreement was that the daughter would go off on a 3-week vacation with the father. The father was the rejected parent, and the mother was not allowed to have any contact with her during that period of time. And then the counseling team would reassess where the child and the rejected parent are at in terms of their reattachment before opening up the door and saying, okay, the child can now start having contact with the mother. So lots of things to consider here. Okay, next. Now, as Craig Childress pointed out in his video, there's a real power imbalance that develops between the rejected parent and the alienating parent. The alienating parent has most of the power, if not all of the power. How do you reverse that, right? How do you even the playing field? So Craig Childress came up with, I thought it was a brilliant idea. So he makes that, so he has it put in a court order that the alienating parent can only have time with the alienating child dependent on their behavior and their willingness to stop their alienating behavior and willingness to support the relationship between the child and the rejected parent. And that's monitored by a professional therapist, right? On the other hand, the alienated child is held accountable because often they will take a position of power in these cases. They will start telling the parents what's going to happen and what's not going to happen. And obviously very inappropriate, a very inappropriate role reversal. So the alienated child needs to be reined in as well, particularly if they're rude, disrespectful, and they enjoy the power and the attention. So what happens in that scenario is the alienated child can only have contact with the alienating parent depending on their behavior with the rejected parent. So are they respectful? Are they polite? Do they engage in activities with the rejected parent? So it gives the rejected parent back at least equal power and an equal chance at being able to reverse the alienation. Okay, I mentioned this a few minutes ago. So what if the child is traumatized by a removal from the alienating parent? So if you look at treatment options, right, there could be, you could give the child time to adjust to the rejected parent with counseling support. You could monitor and assess whether there's the risk of the child running away or self-harming. So alienated children of the severe variety, they actually can run away. And they certainly can threaten it. And they can threaten suicide. So these aren't things to be taken lightly. You have to be on top of it. You have to assess it properly. So you have to assess whether taking the child away from the alienating parent without any contact is going to trigger a mental health crisis of some kind. That needs to be assessed. You could place the child with an alternate caregiver, such as a foster parent who's neutral, does not support the alienation, or it could be grandparents or family friend, etc. So the child may still be able to have some contact with the alienating parent, but in a very supervised, structured situation. And they're living with people who can speak about the rejected parent in a positive way, can provide for the child's needs while transition is starting to happen. The social worker, the PC, the court usually determine access for both the RP and the AP based on the child's adjustment and parental behavior. Once again, a step-up parenting approach could be used with counseling support. Then a detailed plan is required and approved by the decision-making authority. Right? So you do have to be careful when, as you guys know, right? You see lots of kids that have been removed, and you see lots of kids, I'm sure, that have some trauma around that and have some difficulty with that transition. So the same happens when the Family Law Act reverses cover. So I see we only got 20 minutes left. So I'm just gonna go through some of these just to give you something to chew on before our next workshop, which will be workshop number 3 in the fall, yet to be scheduled. So here's some interviewing tips. You need to expect deception, exaggeration, and embellishment. Wherever people are afraid that they're going to be shamed or embarrassed or found to be wrong, or know they've done something wrong, or want to assume a power position over somebody else, they may resort to these kinds of tactics. So you can expect that. So you need to kind of listen with both ears, right? One ear is listening to their narrative and perhaps giving them the benefit of the doubt. You know, what is it they're really trying to communicate to me? The other ear is saying, okay, so what's really going on here? What else do I need to inquire about? You need to realize that children do lie. There used to be a myth that children never lied, right? That they always tell the truth. Well, we know that's false. Children do lie as a way of meeting their own agenda and their own needs, or as a way of survival. So you need to work with children with keeping that in mind. In the initial session, accept the narrative, empathize, be clear on your mandate from the social worker so the child knows, you know, why they're there with you and what you're going to be working on. Also observe their reaction to contradictory information. So if they make a statement and then you said, well, you know, your foster mom told me that that isn't really the case, you know, that it's this rather than that. And then, so you want to observe what's the child's reaction to that? You know, is that new information to them, or is this just a different perception they have than the foster mother, or are they lying, right? So you need to dig into that. You want to check for details in the narratives and corroborate where possible. You want to point out contradictions. You want to engage each parent and the child with videos, games, stories, metaphors, and experiential work. Okay, next slide. Here's more interviewing tips. So I often promote accountability by informing the parents in particular that I'll be communicating, you know, with the court or with the PC, because I don't work in the CFCSA area, but in your case, it might be the social worker, on their cooperation and progress. So it's good for them to know that. And I know you guys write reports to the social worker, and I think that's an opportunity for you to, I'm sure you already do this, point out to the parent, you know, I am writing reports on your cooperation and progress. And I think that's helpful therapeutically. You want to work toward conjoint sessions where possible. It could be between the parents, could be between the child and the favored parent, between the child and the rejected parent. And there might be different goals and interventions that you would use in each of those scenarios. I think it's important to see your counseling style as a mixture of styles. So I used to be much more of a Rogerian listener. I soon learned over time that that's very helpful, very helpful to develop rapport, very helpful to get people to tune into themselves, be aware of their feelings, but not very helpful for people who are resistant, guarded, maybe have other issues that make it difficult for them to self-reflect or even attune to themselves. And also with high conflict families, you need to be directive in a strategic way. So there are times when you need to say to a client, well, I can tell you right now that that's unlikely to happen, right? And I need to say to you that unless you consider changing this behavior, it may result in certain kinds of consequences for you, right? So my recommendation is that you rethink what your next step is, right? So being directive, not in a rude or disrespectful way, but just telling them the way it is, giving them a reality check can be a really good thing. Then I think being reflective and curious is that's something I'm continually reminding myself of, because these families tend to pull you in a variety of different directions, and sometimes you lose your center, you lose your ability to be curious. Why is this person behaving this way? What is this pattern all about? What are they really feeling about this? What's the real issue here, right? Those are questions around curiosity and being able to reflect, rather than just me getting into a reactive mode. Oh my God, a crisis has just exploded in this family. Now I have to react. I have to put the fire out, right? I need to retain that part of me that is curious and reflective. Empathy, of course, is very important, and appropriate self-disclosure. There might be times when you want to share with clients certain experiences that you've had that's helpful to them, helpful in their learning and evolution. And mirror what you want the client to develop in themselves. So if you want them to develop greater self-disclosure, greater honesty, greater transparency, then you want to model that, right? And role model that. Okay, next slide. Okay, so if the favored parent's in the contemplative stage of change, and by the way, if you're not familiar with that model, it was developed back in the 1970s by two psychologists in Texas called Prochaska and DiClemente. And they developed this stage of change model in response to studying why people stop smoking. So they noticed that there were a number of stages of change that people went through before they actually decided to change their smoking habits. So we now can apply this to a variety of different clinical issues. So if the favored parent is in the contemplative stage of change, that is, they're aware that they're part of the problem, but they're not sure if they want to make any changes, and they're capable of self-reflection, then educate them and counsel them about how easy it is to get into blame. And what is blame all about? Forgiveness. Not sure if you've heard of Fred Luskin. He's written a book called The Forgiveness Project, which he studied a lot of dynamics around forgiveness, and he's held lots of educational seminars for people who want to learn how to forgive. So I teach my clients about forgiveness. That's a big piece to teach them about. Opens up their heart more, helps them to see that they're going to be able to unload some of this emotional baggage so they can move on and the child can move on. You might need to help them grieve, particularly for the favored parent, alienating parent. They will experience grief as the alienating child reconnects with the rejected parent, because it'll feel to them like a big loss. So how do you deal with their grief and anxiety over giving up some control? With the rejected parent, if they're in contemplation and they're capable of self-reflection, you can educate and counsel them on taking responsibility for realistic complaints made by the alienating child. So the alienating child may be making some complaints that have some reality to them because of the rejected parent's parenting style. You also want to help them manage their expectations regarding the pace of reconnection. This is an issue that comes up on every file I deal with. The rejected parent is in a rush. When am I going to see my kid? When's this going to happen? When's therapy going to start? How long is it going to take? Right? How much is it going to cost? They're push. And they're pushing their lawyers too. You get emails from the lawyers saying, when is this going to happen? When's that going to happen? So you need to be able to manage their expectations and also manage your own response to that internally, because the response for me is to feel pressure, right? And to feel like I have to make something happen. I have to do it really quickly, rather than doing it slowly, methodically, and doing it right from beginning to end. So very important to manage expectations, and then help them to see where they are counter rejecting and how they can eliminate that. There are two books that I would recommend you have parents work through: Overcoming the Co-Parenting Trap and Overcoming the Alienation Crisis, 33 Co-Parenting Solutions. So the author is John Moran, M-O-R-A-N. I think I put it in your reference list, so you could take a look at that as well. Okay, so we've got 10 minutes left, so I want to give 10 minutes for people who have any questions, and I'd be happy for you to give Shabnez feedback after this session, so that I can give some thought to what we might cover in the next part 3 in the fall. So any questions, if anyone wants to unmute themselves, or anything in the chat that I can deal with? Anybody want to ask anything directly?
Hi, Bob.
Yeah.
I got a question in the box. I'll just ask it here. So I've met with a family where the father was seen as the more dominant, powerful one. He controlled the finances. He was abusive towards the wife, and he said all those disrespectful things to the wife in front of the son. And I saw that the son decided to take the side of the father, which made me feel curious, because the mother is the one who's kind. I mean, she was passive, but she was trying to teach her son her values, which was, be kind to others and hardworking and all that. But the son, I don't know if it's out of fear or whatnot, chose to side with the father and did the same things to the mother. So in your career, is there evidence supporting children in these kind of homes likely side with the more powerful parent for survival or whatnot? I don't know what goes on in the brain. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've answered your own question. Absolutely, it's out of fear. This really powerful parent, they've spent their lifetime before they separated, likely, seeing the father model these behaviors and act in these ways, right? So they've taken that in. Okay, this is how a man acts, and this is how a woman acts, right? They start to internalize some of that stuff. And then post-separation, they see that the father is taking control again, and it's very scary, right? For a child of just about any age. So they will buy into the narrative in order to survive, right? Because if they buy into any other narrative, if they start to consider the mother's perspective, then that might be too dangerous for them. Now, the price they may pay later is, as the child, let's say they get into treatment, and as the child moves from being fully aligned with the father to now becoming what we call a middle stage, which is ambivalence, okay? So let's say they're taught some critical thinking skills. Let's say they start to appreciate what the mother brings to the table. So now they start to feel ambivalent. But then what the child feels is anxiety, shame, because they betrayed the mother. Okay? That's how they would feel, okay? And a lot of anxiety, because now what do? So maybe they start seeing mom, and they're having a good time with mom. Then they go back to dad, and dad's questioning them, interrogating them. So what are they going to do with all of that experience, right? And if they don't say to dad, oh, gee, we had a terrible time, or they just remain silent, they continue to betray the mother, right? So So I think that's some of the dynamics that are going on.
It all makes sense. And what makes me feel curious is, I don't know, maybe it's in the movies that I see. Sometimes you see a child in such a home will step up and protect the mother. Like I've seen, I don't know how realistic that is, but I've seen that in movies, and I think this could play out in real life too. Like, so then what happens to this child, spend a lot of time at home as a young child, but as they grow older, teenagehood into, as a young adult, they get exposed to all sorts of ideas, morals, values. So then, but this child, like, as I know, like kept his way, like throughout, even as a young adult. I wonder, like, don't those outside ideas, kind of knock?
Mhm.
I'm curious about that. You know what I mean?
No, absolutely. I mean, they go to school, they interact with peers, with teachers, they develop their ability to critically think in a different way. Maybe they develop friendships with peers who also are going through a high conflict divorce. They share stories, and there's lots of different other sources of influence that might help to shift them to a more moderate perspective as a beginning, right? And then you want to take them to the end of the road, which is really appreciating mom for what she does and brings to the table, appreciating dad for what he brings to the table, and being able to set their own boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
No, dad, it's no longer okay for you to put down mom in front of me. I'm not going to listen to that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And mom, why don't you speak up more? Like, why are you so passive?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So they start to challenge the parents into a change process.
Mm. Yeah. Thank you, Bob.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So I think we got time maybe for one more question, then we have to go.
This is Bonnie.
Yes.
I have a question typing in here. I don't think it's a typical parental alienation, but it's just a situation I want to know that, would it be, it's really interesting because I have the family that both parents are doing the negative talk about each other, and the son basically just stuck in the between.
Right.
So he will go to the dad and get into fight with the dad, come back home, tell mom, dad say, you don't, you send me there because you don't want me and you don't have time for me.
Right.
And it's kind of back and forth, and both parents are doing negative talk about each other.
Right.
So the son basically kind of feel like nobody wants him.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, we do know, for example, that even where there is alienating behavior, not all children become alienated. Okay? So some children have the ability to resist that. They have more resilience, or they can be in the middle of a high conflict situation, and they may be able to find a way to navigate through that, even though both parents are being negative about the other, and they're fighting with each other, etc. So here you're telling me that both parents are engaging in alienating behavior, but the child has decided not to align with one parent over the other in order to deal with it. Because a lot of kids will do that. If they don't feel strong enough, they will pick one of those parents and say, okay, I'm going to be on their side in this war, and I'm not going to see the other parent, so I don't have to hear the other parent's negative comments, and I'll just side with one parent, right? And that'll be the solution to my problem, and then I'll just avoid the other parent. So kids react in different ways depending on their own personality, their own coping abilities, their own resilience. But typically, if you're going to work with that child, I'd be working with that child around, what is it like for you to be in the middle of this war? What does that feel like? We're really getting them to get in touch with their emotions and feelings about that. And what is it that they can take control of in this situation about themselves, right? And there's lots of interventions you can do around that as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have to go for today. I hope this was useful, and Shabniz and I will be in touch probably sometime in the fall about scheduling a third session. Third session will be about 2 hours. Yeah. So I really appreciate if you gave Shabniz feedback, so I know whether I'm on track or not with the presentation, and if you have any suggestions or ideas for the next session.
I would also add, it would be really beneficial that if you guys are still processing some of the material, I know I do. I usually take sometimes I need to percolate with something for about a week. And then I'll be like, these are the things that pop up into my head that I really just need to chew on a bit more and need to hash out. So if you have questions to follow up some of this material as well, maybe be prepared with it. Maybe send it to me. I can send it to Bob in advance as well. I would really love that email. And I know that Bob and I will be connecting as well. And I know that really provides him direction in what things to answer and delve into a bit more deeply.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Wesley. And thank you everybody for showing up and all your insightful questions. I will be sending follow-up emails after Bob and I have more contact about the fall.